My name is Claude Schreier, and this is a radio program about Vancouver-based writer, academic, critic, and social activist Robin Mathews. Mathews was born in Smithers, BC in 1931, and has made important and unique contributions to Canadian literary, political, educational, and philosophical life. This radio program is based on an interview I recorded with him in January 2004 for a CBC Radio Out Front program called Extending Towards the People, that was first broadcast on the CBC on September 15th, 2004. This program involves a layering of discussions about political poetry in Canada, the role of the artist in society, and about family matters, in particular his relationship with me as my father-in-law. The program also includes Robin reading excerpts of his poetry, as well as some of my soundscape compositions.
They ask for a person rounded as a pebble is rounded in an old river. Tell the capitalist bastards, they'll get gorillas, and Guevarists, and Ho Chi Minhs, and Nelson Mandelas, and Norman Bethuans, and Wolverines, and splitting the skies, and they will get other quiet, very determined men and women, and yes, boys and girls who blow themselves clear through the atmosphere, along with the bragging capitalist enemy and their quiet supporters. Or they will get, more carefully, those who drop whole buildings full of people who plan oppression of all the disadvantaged on the planet. Tell them over and over. Tell them at their world trade meetings and at the meetings of rotten military alliances disguised as defense initiatives. Tell them the people's longing for a small measure of human justice will produce again and again heroes who, right now, are preparing to appear, who will go for the capitalist jugular and will go for it until they have it tight and sure in their grasp. Then, for all that is good in human life, they will hold on tightly and not let go. The tradition in Canada is a grand and noble one, both in French and English. On the English side, probably the greatest 19th century Canadian poet, Archibald Lampman, was a socialist poet and declared he was that. That was a part of a developing tradition that F.R. Scott, the great constitutional lawyer and theorist, who was also a very, very fine poet and a political poet in no uncertain terms, which extends into Dorothy Livesey and Milton Acorn and people I came to know, of course. And it seemed to me always that to pretend that the political sphere was not something that you lived and breathed and walked in was to lie about life. Political poetry is not something that you only do, and it's not something that one absolutely has to do. But to have a country where there are very few political poets is to have a country that is somehow damaged. Because if poetry arises from the passions of the person involved with life, then the passions of politics have to be involved too. And so it seems to me that the important Canadian poets have always been aware of the political sphere and taken part in it. Even Norman Bethune, the great Canadian doctor hero of the Spanish Civil War and China, was an extremely fine poet, and his poetry was political poetry. At the center of capitalism, 50% of blacks under 25 are unemployed. Millions and millions of citizens own private handguns so they can kill each other. Inner cities are like hell in flames. 40 million people are without medical security. Hospitals turn away the sick who cannot produce credit cards. Central America lies in chains. Canada is taught greed, brutality, the joy of unemployment. The Third World everywhere offers the products of slave economies for classy receptions in New York penthouses. Half the world starves, so capitalism and its criminal leaders can celebrate in classy New York penthouses the death of socialism. As you move outward from the person, as you move outward from the subjective being, as you move outward from the ego and begin to embrace the community around you, you find that poets differentiate themselves. There are the poets who write about their own internal anguish. There are poets who write about love, and then there are poets who write about the natural order, and even some write about community. And then the extension, of course, is into political community. And so one of the problems in Canada today is that a great many poets and poetical theorists say that you cannot write political poetry. They shut out a part of life. And by so doing, they deny a part of life and they deny a part of the Canadian sphere. And so they become, in many ways, copycats, and they become parochial. Because if you deny the sphere of life in which you find yourself and that you copy others, and in many cases among Canadians they copy US poets who are indoctrinated to be unpolitical, then they think the great poet is the unpolitical US poet and I will be like him or her, and so they completely separate themselves from the Canadian society in which they live and breathe and have their being. Political poetry is very often argumentative poetry, persuasive poetry, but that we have to look at that again, because there's political poetry that is visibly political poetry, but a great deal of the poetry which claims not to be political poetry is in fact political poetry because it gives total assent to the present ruling order. And when you give total assent to the present ruling order, you are in fact taking a political position. What they mean when they say they don't want to see political poetry is they don't want to see poetry which challenges the established order of power. It offends the established order of power. The established order of power is the giver of gifts. The giver of gifts are situated in arts councils and universities, and they are less likely to give gifts to people who offend the established order of power. So a lot of artists who want a very quiet life and they want gentle assistance through this very quiet life do not want to challenge the established order of power. So along comes an artist or a poet who does so, and they say, that's political poetry, that's political painting, we don't want that. That isn't art, that is propaganda. Quite unaware that they too are creating propaganda, but propaganda for established power, not against established power. Don't look terrified, I say, meeting him by accident on the street outside the stock exchange. You market brokers won, remember? Tokyo, Berlin, London, Hong Kong, New York, Toronto, and more, all hooked up. 24-hour stock news around the world at the speed of light. Good news everywhere since the death of socialism. Real wages peeling back like a roadhouse stripper. Smile, man, smile. Big corporations are running the world. Democracy's doing it. Jobs surfacing everywhere in the slave economies. lots of jobs, workers at hand for chicken feed. I think the artist's role in society can be seen in about three different ways. The artist, first of all, wants to make the credible work of art. And if the artist is a painter of daffodils, then the artist should paint daffodils all of his or her life. One cannot say an artist should be this or that, but in the large picture, it seems to me, the artist's role in the society is to be a part of the society, to be an interpreter of the society. And I think a statement by Fidel Castro is apt here, because when, shortly after the revolution, Fidel had a meeting with all the artists in Cuba, and he said, you can paint anything you want. You can paint abstract, you can paint representationally, you can paint flowers, you can paint ships, you can paint soldiers, you can paint anything you want. But you cannot paint against the revolution. If you paint against the revolution, we will stop you. And I think that showed enormous breadth. He didn't say social realism is workers in factories paint that. You can paint anything you want. And some people in Canada will say, oh, well, of course, that's very restrictive, and of course he is censoring painters. But Canada says you can paint anything you want as long as you don't paint against capitalism. And exactly in the same way that Fidel said about the revolution. And if you paint actively against capitalism, you disappear out of the galleries in Canada. From Cuba, pure rose of the Caribbean, you came, Fidel, asking why people live in disease and poverty, why babies die in their mother's arms, why the lives of children are wasted, the bodies of young men broken, so a few can swill like swine in the food and drink meant for all. Cuba's heart was wrung by Batista's executioners until you walked on the sand, until you lifted the eyes of the people to the mountains, until you told them again the Americas do not belong to capitalists in the USA. You lifted the eyes of the people to the mountains, overcame disease and poverty, taught babies to grow from their mother's arms, gave purpose to the lives of children, shaped the bodies of young men in strength. When you drove Batista from Cuba and your people learned freedom in socialism, then the U.S. became determined to destroy you, to destroy the pure rose of the Caribbean, to replace the thug Batista with a worse thug who can return Cubans to lives of disease, waste, terror, and death. You burn in the Caribbean as a ruby burns in a golden crown. They want your death, Fidel. They want to destroy the Cuba you have helped to build, believing if they do that, they will convince the world it has heard the last breath before the death of socialism. I think that the concept of beauty in art as you say, in the late 19th century, and in the Group of Seven, if you want to use painters as an example. Yes, one can say that it was more visible previously. But a great deal of art which thinks that it is about social issues today is not. It is incommunicado. It does not speak to the viewer, and in a good deal of the poetry, it is not heard by the listener. It's some kind of in-group conversation which is artistically exclusive. And it seems to me that political poetry, political art, must extend towards the people. And that's a very difficult thing to do. One does not write or paint or write music or whatever it is, which wants to engage the larger population and still maintain artistic standards. That is not an easy thing to do. And a great many artists don't do it. They speak to a parochial, in-group, terminological group, and they think that they are doing work of significance in the society, and they are not. But I think the artist, in defense of the artist, I think the artist is someone who's deeply curious about what the world means. And that has to include what he or she themselves mean. And I think the artist is more funneled in that direction than others. I had a friend visiting me, and we were looking at a painting or two that I had done. And I said to him, "But Jean, we are all artists." And he said, "No, Robin, we are not all artists." And I thought that was very amusing, because I just took it for granted that people didn't do artistic things because they didn't feel like it, they didn't have time, they didn't want to. But of course, if they set their minds to, they would. And he was saying, no, they wouldn't, because they don't know how to set their minds to it. And I think that's the magic and the excitement and the wonder of artists and being among artists and knowing artists, is that they're constantly refining the skill that lets them tell themselves about the world around them. And so in doing that, when they are greatly successful, as say Dorothy Livesey is in poetry, and Milton Acorn in poetry, and Jack Shadbolt in his painting, and Joe Plaskett in his painting, when they're successful, others step into that world through the artist's ability. The others step through that window into the wonder of what the artist does and is in society. And that seems to me something you have to grant as real. When you look at the fecundity of some of our artists, you stand back in wonder and delight at these made things. And that's the other thing I think that every artist knows. The making of something that was never that existed before and wouldn't have existed without that person. That's a magic. You think, wow, did I do that? Yes, I did do that. was it Cicero who said, poeta nascitur orator fit, the poet is born, the prose writer is trained. I think poeta nascitur, I think artists are. I don't think, then I think they become the kind of artists they are because of the world they live in. And I used to say to my students, Michelangelo is, let us say, the great artist of the Renaissance, Picasso, the great artist of the 20th century. If Picasso had lived in Michelangelo's time, he would have painted the Sistine Chapel. And if Michelangelo had lived in the 20th century, he would have created Picasso's work. The great artist is supercharged, all artists, supercharged to make, to create. And their times hand them the paintbrush or put the pen in their hands to make the things that they make in that age with that society and those people. It's not important that Lenin lied, that Stalin ruled as a serial killer, that the long line of geriatrics who followed could only bar the door and stand with pistols at the single window until Mikhail Gorbachev walked out into the street unarmed, in ordinary clothes, to talk about the ruined economy, the folly of the war in Afghanistan, to talk about a renewed Soviet Union, a renewed communism. What is important is that the US capitalism saw its chance to fatten from the flesh of the socialist world even more than before, to fatten on the bodies of the Eastern Bloc people and on their new belief in capitalist lies. What is important is that Harvard experts and US State Department advisors set out to make the socialist bloc a capitalist market through shock therapy, describing US capitalist greed as the new paradise to come after the death of socialism. Poetry is, alas, a special language, and it is a language, just as musical sounds are language. And so the readership of poetry is never large, except in, occasional surges when populations pick up certain poets, but not usually large, and that's all there is to it. I remember coming out to Vancouver to do something with a union, and somebody said, "Oh, I think I know you, don't I?" And I said, "Well, no, I don't think so." "Oh," he said, "I remember, of course." He said, "You're the person who was the poet for the movement, weren't you?" And I said, "Well, I'm pleased to hear that." But I thought that was very nice. It meant that people were reading me as a part of the movement of history at the time and saying, yes, this is speaking what I'm caring about. And I wasn't even aware that they were doing that, which I think is very gratifying too. It means that there is an audience, there is a place, and the poet is, in a sense, filling a social role at the same time as not sacrificing the quality of the art. You see, this is the thing that you know is, I suppose, one of the problems with making art is the bastardizing of it for, how would you say it, for mass appeal. And all artists are fearful of that. In fact, I have a lovely poet friend who, when one of our poet acquaintances suddenly is writing a lot of junk and getting a lot of attention, she says to me, "Poets are not rock stars." And a lot of poets want to be rock stars. And so there's always balancing on that tightrope, especially if you write political poetry, of fighting for a standard of excellence in the work as poetry, at the same time as doing the other thing, which is communicating in a political way, that is to say, to a larger audience, to the people, about the kind of community in which they live. And I always wanted to write a war love poem. I was talking to a young friend of mine who likes Nameless Lover very much. And I said, I'm glad you like it because it took me 40 years to write it. I wanted to write that poem, which has to be a love poem, but is written into the heart and hatefulness of war. And I think it works. But I knew I was struggling for that. And one always struggles, as I say. The lyric poem, the poem about one's own effusions, the poems about love, are much less difficult to write in terms of their technical credibility. The poems in the public sphere are much harder to write in that way. It has been interesting to me to take on the challenge of working towards political poetry that asserts itself as poetry as well as political utterance, because it's not easy. Nameless lover lying here, all that's beautiful and fine, stay the waves, stay the winds, hear your pulse repeating mine. Stay, oh stay and hold my heart, each body holding each in sway. Hold the moment, dearest love, hold it back from light and day. As we share the ecstasy that anchorites on pillars show, madmen gone beyond the world, that other secret lovers now find hid in rare topographies, yet the silly young, we know, are dying out on battlegrounds, called on this night, Kosovo. There they sprawl, unhoused, alone, all their beauty wrung from them. Empty-eyed, they stare in stone, time gone forever, time and love. Their arthritic murderers raining senseless terror down, live for avarice and power, empire and the ermine gown. Naked, lovely, shorn of guile, you sprawl beautiful without defense. We each love each and darkly hold as absolute this present tense. Beauty goes. With wind and water, all that's precious melts away. The perfectly enchanting smile is lost in usual decay. Nothing now, nor nothing ever, even so, can break this pact, faithful to the mortal hour, consummate in loving act. Well, my advice to the young political poet is to write. I met a young man who was a student, and who said to me, "You can't write political poetry. Political poetry doesn't exist really." And I said, the poet writes about those things which involve him or her passionately. And if politics involve you passionately, you write poetry about it. And he said, that makes perfect sense. And has become an admirer of political poetry since. And so I say to the political poet in Canada, write, publish, and do not listen to the critics who say political poetry is not art. They are cowards.
Think freedom. Think Mao. Think Che Guevara. Think Salvador Allende, riddled with bullets for being so good. Think Fidel, too tough to be slaughtered like Allende, holding tough against capitalism, its U.S. designs. Think Daniel Ortega, his revolution beaten to death by murdering Yankees. They drink blood of children from goblets of gold, liking to call it rarest wine. Transformed to rarest wine from the bodies and blood of children by U.S. capitalism. Think Daniel Ortega, a pressed white shirt now, a clean suit, walking among his beaten people alone. Think Hugo Chavez, Viva Viva Venezuela, fighting to break out of Yankee prison for South America, for all the oppressed. Think Norman Bethune, who was our own. Think him in Canada, Spain, China, East and West, battling to preserve life, healing, curing, saving, encouraging. Think Norman Bethune. Think them gathering together, all together, building the moment when people lift their goblets of clay to drink the clean, fresh water of dignity and justice everywhere. Think of them. Think freedom.
I would say absolutely, but you asked me what the advice was to the young person who wanted to be a political poet, and I said write and do not take no for an answer. But certainly I believe that the artist in Canada needs to be more political than the artist is. And by political, I don't just mean environmental, green, racial, those kinds of things. I mean confronting head-on the iniquities of capitalism and government manipulated by capitalism to the detriment of the larger population in the country. I think they have to do that in and out of their work. And I think very often of when I say the painter who only wants to paint daffodils all of his or her life should do so. But that doesn't mean that that painter shouldn't write the right things about the social order, should not be in the streets when called upon to be in the streets to defend the rights of the weakest and the most victimized. No, the artist should live and breathe in the society and should have the guts to take leading roles where human rights and human dignity are at stake. The lady in the high-class store backs the madmen on the hill. She blesses them and thinks it right that they should kill, because the world, she says, is bad and good. Our leaders stand up for the right. The bad must feel our heavy wrath falling on them in the night. The lady in the high-class store doesn't wish her neighbor ill, doesn't have a racist hate, doesn't rifle from the till. Like you and me, she starts her day with coffee by her lawn-side view, sews for her daughter, loves her son, fears the different and the new. She talks about our U.S. friends. She says they need to go to war. As friends, we ought to follow them. We can't do less, she thinks, or more. She's built herself a fortress mind. She wanders in a burning wood where ad men tell her what is true. The TV tells her what is good. She doesn't know her choice has been packaged somewhere far away. When she sees there's throwing stones, she wants to throw some of her own. Her leaders know that. They depend that she'll continue being she. They build their banal madness on her firm predictability. Capitalism is a problem because, unlike most other ideologies, it has no redeeming theory. The role of capitalism is to accumulate capital, to accumulate savings, to increase savings, to compete, and to destroy competitors. There is nothing in capitalism, if you look at capitalism clearly in itself, it nowhere says it is our responsibility to lift up the poor, it is our responsibility to care for the aged, it is our responsibility to build a beautiful society. Capitalism's responsibility is to amass wealth and to destroy its competitors. That is its fundamental activity. And unless you have a very powerful society around capitalism saying, yes, you may do some of those things, but you must also have deep responsibility to the society, capitalism will become wholly irresponsible. And if you study it, you cannot get another answer out of it. And when people say, oh, but there are good capitalists, if there are, it's an accident. If you wish to describe the role of the artist in society, in every coup, whether it's a right-wing coup or a left-wing coup, after every revolution or coup, first you shoot the politicians, and then you shoot the generals, and then you shoot a selected number of artists. Because those societies know the power of the artist, and some of them are always offensive to the order that takes over and are removed. So that's a statement about where the artist is, whether artists who say, oh, I don't have any politics, I don't have any relation to society. You can answer, yes, you don't, maybe, because you're hiding in one way or another, but artists do. And the artist who starves may be a bad artist, but it's a very difficult thing in a lifetime to divine, because some artists starve because they should, and some artists starve because they're so far ahead of the generation in which they find themselves. But one has to recognize a truth, that 80% of all art, written, spoken, composed, etc., is trashed in the next 100 years. And much of that 80% that is trashed is the art of the bestsellers, the art that has filled the galleries, which should make anyone think. It's not only in the family that that's the case. I think it's in the society. And I have to admit something to you that I hadn't thought about. Very often when I've been under duress and despised and rejected, I've said to myself, you will continue writing political poetry and other poetry. And you will do so for the generations that come after. Because when they look at this generation, they must not say there was no one who saw the political situation among the artists. And so I say, all right, I won't be read now, but maybe I will be read in 25 years, 50 years, 75 years. Maybe it will be very important. I remember walking down a hallway in Ottawa, and a visitor from Toronto said to me, oh, Robin, what are you doing right now? This was in the early 60s, I think. I said, I'm reading Harold Innes. He said, "Harold Innes, you're not under 30, are you?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Oh, because Harold Innes disappeared for some years. And then all of a sudden, he was needed, dug up, and rediscovered and became a major thinker for the activists of the 60s and 70s. And I thought how wonderful that this happened to Innes, and this can happen to work. And so one can be deluding oneself completely, but there are many times I've said, all right, this body of work is going to be written. I think that the generations turn around in a very strange way. I think my grandchildren, yes, some of them might, my great-grandchildren might, but if this is what happens, of course, as I said about the 30s, if we come upon a period where political poetry becomes demanded and is read, then they will read me, and they will all say, "Oh, my grandfather wrote all this stuff, and wasn't he interesting? We must go down to the National Archives and dig out some of his papers and find out who he was." But I don't think that they will. Maybe there will be a family story. It's very hard to know. Very, very hard to know. One of them may suddenly be fascinated that he had a grandfather who was me, and write a PhD thesis on me. That's true. One leaves traces, and that's an interesting thing about the artist, and I think all artists at a certain age suddenly know that. I have left traces. And you know it when you look into the generation behind you and try to pick up tracks and traces, and they disappear very, very quickly. Remarkably quickly. You do know a few items about aunts and uncles, but great parts of their lives just disappear. And I say to myself every now and then, oh, well, they can always go to the National Library and read all my books. They can go to the National Archives and dig through some of my papers, which isn't the case for everyone. So certainly there is that aspect of it, but to predict how that will be welcomed or used or experienced, it's impossible for me to say. And that's true also, of course, about the larger public. As I remember Earl Burney, the poet, the very good poet, being interviewed, and someone talked to him about immortality, and he chuckled and said, come now, there is no immortality for the artist. He said, we have Homer, but there must have been all kinds of artists before Homer, and we don't even know that they existed. He said, no, time erases all things. And I thought that was a wonderfully modest and way to see things in a cool perspective. Well, that's an interesting thing, too, about the artist. When I was sitting in the cabin in Quebec by the little lake and writing those poems, I didn't think of another generation sitting in that cabin and perhaps reading those poems. It never occurred to me at that time. So it's quite interesting to think that that whole environ, whatever you want to call it, is there in the poems for whoever is sitting in that cabin reading, you know. The castle would be over there under the bluff or on it, looking down the lake. The river called La Nation would have a genius, and the lake would keep a monster in a last dark, undiscovered cave. The eye would pick up arches, pyramids and cones, all kinds of porticos and shining domes. The forest would be, of course, a planted park. What if I tell you I walk by Lac Petit Poisson Blanc, feeling the reeds on my bare feet, or that I swim here, or lie on plain hot sand, undocumented, unobserved. On certain days, the green ocean surges over everything. Then I inhabit bright, translucent deeps by coral crenellations where multicolored fish hover among orchards full of golden sunshine, ripe apples, and purified rain.
You think everything bursts with life, the way the little boys do. You think everyone has as much time as the little boys have. Though I have told you, I should have taken the old man's hand, your grandfather's hand, and said, "Today we will drive again through Paradise Valley, down Thunder Bay Road to the sea." I should have said, "Look, Dad, this is the place. Here at Wolfson Creek, remember? Where we always stopped for a bonfire, or to watch from the bridge as the humpback fought upwards to the spawning grounds. Here, look, we camped right here, remember? On the edge of Loon Lake. And when someone else arrived, we said, 'There are lots of lakes. Why do they have to come to the one we're on?' I see him at the wheel of the 36 Chev. I see him lift the spaniel away from the car's path. I see him driving out from the Parryville shack as dusk falls to teach one more lesson. I see him at the piano, improvising on Bach and Beethoven, making music that flows like a garden of butterflies, a garden of unrepeatable marvels, flowing like butterflies away. Now he is out of reach, always over there, leaving a smell of damp Harris tweed, of Yardley's aftershave lotion, memories, but never again the touch of those strong, veined artist's hands.
one of the things, Claude, that I learned when I went through my education at UBC, at the University of Toronto, and in University in the United States, which is not so important, there was practically no Canadian material. And as I was a poet, I began reading the Canadian 19th century. And when we began insisting upon Canadian curriculum in colleges, universities, and the schools, it was because when I was a PhD student, I was invited to read third and fourth rate English poets. I've got nothing against third or fourth rate English poets, but I was invited to read them before I had read Canadian poets who were infinitely better. And I thought, what's going on here? No one is teaching me Duncan Campbell Scott or Archibald Lampman or Charles G.D. Roberts or Isabella Valenci Crawford or Charles Mayer. They're teaching me third-rate British 19th century poets. And I thought, there's something wrong with our society if we are not looking at our own great writers. And of course, there are great writers in Canada. And when you say it, people are embarrassed in Canada. Go to the universities and colleges and see how much of those people I just mentioned are being taught. If they're not embarrassed, they're ignoring the wealth that's of their own country that's in front of them. There's a painting by Joe Plaskett in the cabin by the lake of an elegant interior with mirrors and reverberating chandeliers. The cabin feels a little awkward with so much beauty in a little space. But the old world colors add charm, a reminiscent decadence of artificial forms. The eye settles in the painting's haunted places, remembering things gone past, remembering the haunted faces of a world we said goodbye to at long last. Flowers are forever blooming on the mantel shelf within the frame, as if the painter set them down there, a token on the tomb, remembering. That fight doesn't stop, and it is a deeply important one, as you suggest. It's about identity. It's about self-assurance in actions in the public sphere. And I remember distinctly teaching Susanna Moodie. Susanna Moodie's Roughing It in the Bush and Life in the Clearings and other things. And Susanna Moodie came to Canada in 1832 as a bride and lived her life out in Canada and wrote greatly in this country. And I was teaching Roughing It in the Bush. And a red-haired young man of about 23 with a French-Canadian name who was unilingual English came up to me at the end of one of the lectures and he said to me, Susanna Moodie isn't an English woman. And I said, no, she's not. And he said, she's Canadian. And I said, yes, she is. And he said, she's writing about me. And I said, yes, she is. And I thought, what a brilliant moment that was. Here was, as I say, a young man of 23 with red hair and a French-Canadian name from the prairies saying, this woman is writing about my identity. And when you read your own literature, then it becomes possible for you to inhabit your own social sphere, your own landscape, and therefore to be much firmer and more certain about the actions you take in your own country and in the world. And Canadians have been denied that constantly, and because of our proximity to the most powerful nation in the world, we go on being denied it willingly and unwillingly, constantly. And will they look, if they are writers, to the literature of their own country? How many of them have read carefully the literature of their own country? And so their images, if they haven't, their images run out of New York, out of San Francisco. It's a terrible, terrible problem in a culturally colonized country. How do you set your artists firmly in their own sphere? Now, it's interesting that over and over again, there have been Canadian artists who absolutely insist on the legitimacy of this place. I mean, you can talk about the Group of Seven, which is a group of painters who are great painters, period. And when you look around, I look around me here, at the West Coast painters, people like Shadbolt and so on have done remarkable work in this sphere, in this landscape, in this light, in this environment. So that the struggle goes on and is won, but too many artists succumb to a kind of vacuous internationalism, and they think they're enormously chic. The artist wants to bring you into a possibility, but all artists are total converters, because one wouldn't be an artist unless one had a worldview, and having the worldview one for oneself knows that this is the correct worldview, and if someone is foolish enough to disagree, that's perfectly okay. But there's both sides of the artistic personality, which says if you don't, and I often say that to people, if you read 10 pages of my book and you don't like it, don't read the rest. Why should you read what you don't like? But that doesn't mean that I think, therefore, because you have read 10 pages and don't like the book, I will throw the book away. The book has its legitimacy as far as I'm concerned, and must have. So both faces are there. But that's very good, because when I published my first book of poems, friends wrote to me and said, this is the best poem and this is the worst one, and they all chose different poems. And I thought, how witty, and I realized that one thinks that one, how can I say it? One thinks that one discovers poetry, but I think really one discovers oneself. And by that I mean you go to a poem at 18 and it's meaningless. You go to it at 28 and it suddenly has meaning. Now the poem hasn't changed, but you have become ready to read that poem. And so when people reject the poetry, I say, fine. It means that you aren't now ready to read it, or may never be. Other people read it and say, oh, this is like manna from heaven, and you think, isn't that wonderful? This person has come to that work just at a moment when they're ready to hear the things that it says. The slap on water called us down when they were passing by, feeding close to shore. Each a personality, personable, would look our way and chuckle, mixing soft laughter with a playful smile, the way whales do. Power and beauty and godly, graceful movement made us humble, full of wonder, full of cosmic, prayerful gratitude. All the dirty, petty greed and ego-driven ugliness of humankind became dwarfed in their company. In fact, became beyond belief, untenable, beneath contempt
But now, underneath the wondrous waters where they make their home, they are dying, and no one cares enough to say, enough. Poisons prepared for them by humankind and food stocks looted for the sake of greed are killing them. First we killed God, then wonder, then our place with other creatures on the globe, and now, the last, we kill all semblance of humility. Pride goeth before a fall, they say, and they also say, when the whales go, all else will follow. It doesn't do to dictate about the artist, because the artists are as various as it is possible to be. And a great many artists can only have their being in withdrawal and insularity, retreat and silence. And so to call upon them to be social activists would be wounding and maybe destructive. But in the large picture of the artist in the society, even the artist that I have described must in himself or herself recognize that to be artist is a special function and a special blessing. And in response to it, the artist must take responsibility for the nature of the society in which he or she lives. And that's asking a great deal, but I don't think it's asking too much.